Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justformorefix.com or on Twitter at justformorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you can give us a rating or review at Apple Podcasts, wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to talk about using an assistant storyteller. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Willie D. Nelson from All Things Good and Nerdy, a pop culture podcast, part of the Gonna Geek Network. Just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other tantalizingly geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. Today we are going to talk about using an assistant storyteller. So in this one, we're going to kind of define some weird terms and kind of set some things up so this will all make sense to those of you that are not familiar with larger games or LARPs, or specifically Mind's Eye Theater, right? So this came about from a game that we had at HillCon, and we had Lacey was running a game, which was the Three Sisters game, from the Beast of Gévaudan side. And I sat down, and part of the idea when we played that game was that me, Lee, and Carrie, who had played the Three Witches and made the Three Witches, should not actively be playing in that game as a test because of knowledge that we had, right? So I didn't have anything to do, so Lacey had me sit down and play the Three Witches, essentially, but more from the background, not like full on in the characters' faces, especially from the beginning, right?
Okay, so to clarify, because you terribly muddled that, nobody who didn't play that game would be able to follow it.
Okay.
The players sitting down to play the game at HillCon were playing adventurers that were going to encounter and try and kill the Beast of Gévaudan.
Right.
Whereas you were playing from the side of the witches who are trying to protect the werewolf.
Correct. Okay.
Right. So you weren't supposed to sit down and play as an adventurer coming to slay the beast because you know all of the plot points from the other side of things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of where this starts off. So we're going to give you a brief background on the way a Mind's Eye Theater game works and the way specifically on the staff side of things for how those games work, because they're kind of big. So for those of you that don't know, Mind's Eye Theater is the system for Vampire the Masquerade and Mage of the Ascension and Werewolf and all of the different White Wolf products. And they are just not freeform. They are a LARP, but it's a social political LARP, generally speaking, when it comes to.
So if you've never done LARP and that's not your wheelhouse, LARP is live action role playing.
Correct.
Where you role play quite literally as the character that you make. You come in costume, you enter the room acting as them and performing their actions.
Right.
Not sitting at a table, but socializing and moving about the room.
Right. And one important distinction between most LARPs, or every LARP that we've really been involved with, versus a tabletop game is the amount of players. So in my mind, the ideal size of players for a Mind's Eye Theater game is somewhere between like 15 and 30. I feel like between those numbers, you have enough players to have a well-rounded cast, a well-rounded set of characters that are always in motion doing something, but it's also not so big that it's completely unwieldy and you can still keep track of the game, right? Well, when you have this many players, you can't have one person running the game anymore. It's just too much for one person to do. So in our case, the way it worked is that there was a head storyteller who had sort of say over the overall game and was generally speaking running the main plot, right, for what was happening. And then functioning underneath them where there are two other levels of people. There are assistant storytellers and then narrators, right? So a narrator, generally speaking, doesn't have any creative control over the game. They are just there for sort of like rules adjudication and kind of that kind of stuff,
so
right?
Like the assistant referee on the field.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
They're keeping an eye on the play from the angle that you're not seeing.
So they're just sort of to keep the game moving along, and like if there's a combat, they do rules arbitration and they run the combat. Now these people also oftentimes are actual players as well. So they're playing in the game, but they're just there to sort of keep the game moving along in a rules sort of like administrative kind of a way, right? If there's rules questions about how something works. The role we're going to focus on here is the assistant storytellers. So in their case, a lot of times there is a larger plot that is running across the entire city, right? So we're going to talk about this in the vampire terms. That's what we, on our end, we're most familiar with. And then the assistant storytellers, with a game of about 30 people, you might have 1 or 2 assistant storytellers, just depending, right? And sometimes it would just depend on how the workload wanted to be divided up. Sometimes it might be by clan. So I'll take these 3 clans and you'll take these 3 clans or whatever. Or it might be by theme or something. Just kind of depended on how things sort of worked. And while they sort of worked in conjunction with the main storyteller, and they would sort of give the storyteller would have overall say of what was going to happen, but they sort of had an idea of plots that they were going to run and things that they wanted to do, and they had their own adversaries and antagonists that they were running and in charge of. But ultimately, it wasn't their game, right? It's the storyteller's game.
So in the LARP, you have kind of what we refer to as running scenes. And so your assistant storytellers are often there to help run a scene, which is where, maybe a particular plot point is going to be dropping. It may be part of the larger plot, or it may be a subplot that is only relevant to a small group within the LARP.
Right. A lot of times, if there are specific NPCs that are recurring, those specific NPCs will be played by the same assistant storyteller to keep some consistency in terms of like tone and flavor when it comes to role playing and that kind of stuff. And oftentimes, if those are consistent recurring NPCs, then that's where we get closer to what we had at our tabletop game, where they're more running what the antagonist is doing in the background and making decisions on the fly and trying to portray them in a full way, like they're almost a full character. Like they have a full character sheet probably if they're an important NPC and that kind of stuff, so that you know the limits of what they're capable of. But the story remains not about them. They're there to function as an antagonist and cause problems or bring out moments of drama or cool character moments, like being a foil to one of the characters or something. And that's their primary function, is to add to the game as an antagonist, right? They're not there to win necessarily. Not that they never win, but that's not their purpose. They're not there to be obstructive. They're there to add to the game, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of something hard to wrap your head around initially, because
I think, so what kind of kicked it off for me from the Lamentations of the Flame Princess perspective is there have been a lot of times where I've sat down to run a game or even a pre-made adventure, and you're trying to keep an eye on the overall arc of the plot. You're trying to remember the mechanics for, the beast or the creature that you have set up, whatever the main baddie is. And then you're also trying to keep track of a cast of NPCs, and oftentimes those NPCs end up being a little flat because you just have so much going on, and you're also trying to adjudicate everybody's actions that are popping up on the fly. And even when you're doing a really good job, having somebody to help you out in bringing those characters to life more fully, I feel like could only be a good thing.
Right. I agree. I think this was, obviously we've had lots of success with it in LARP, but we've just never brought those same themes and ideas over to the tabletop side of things for whatever reason. And thankfully, at least at our table, we have a pretty full table, generally speaking. So a GM and between, anywhere between 3 and 6 players sometimes, depending on how things go. And nearly everyone at the table is a game master of some sort, depending on the system and whatever. And so we're kind of spoiled that way. So I will say that this may be a little difficult of a hurdle to overcome initially if you wanted to try this, if you have a table that doesn't have experience running games, I guess.
And I don't know that I would necessarily bring it to a game if I have a table that's me and, 3 other people.
Right.
But if you sit down and you are at the point where you have 5 or 6 people.
Right.
Then it might behoove you to give this a try.
Right. I agree. Because then it allows the game master to focus solely on the players and stuff. So now that we've kind of laid out what it is in terms of mind's eye theater, why don't we break down how it actually worked at our table, right? Mm-hmm. Do you want to do that, or do you want me to?
I mean, so we talked about it a little bit, but I basically had, like I said, the overarching plot of the game, and you were familiar with that, which is something that has to happen.
It has to happen, right?
Whoever your assistant storyteller is needs to be familiar with, any plot twists that are going to be coming up. I suppose I say that, but maybe, if they're playing an NPC, I suppose, depending on how they fit in the mix of the political world or whatever,
Right.
you could catch them off guard with something as well. But
Right.
in general, that's what you're looking for. And then, so there was a whole host of what I would call minor NPCs, people that they could interact with, potentially get information from. But if they didn't spend a lot of time with them, it wasn't going to be like world breaking.
Right.
And so those were, ran by me just like you normally would.
Right.
So what I gave you were larger NPCs that one had intelligent thought. So
Right.
I wouldn't give you a werewolf to play if it was just a creature of death and destruction. I picked you to do it because you are conniving, as are these NPCs.
Right.
Oh, not just you specifically, but like humans in general,
I know what you
conniving.
mean.
It would be a waste of human talent to have
Right.
you play like a pig. That would be silly.
Aw, thanks.
So I would say that that's probably a good way to go about it if you have, a major NPC in your plot who is going to be recurring, is of significance. And
I think to put this in kind of context in sort of like a movie kind of a way, right? So the movie is about the characters, right? So this game we're playing, the characters that are pursuing the Beast of Gévaudan are the main characters of the story, right? And the Beast obviously is the object, the quest or whatever. And while there are loads of people, NPCs that are built into this game, when you watch a movie like Sleepy Hollow, for example, right? I think it's a decent comparison. There are all these other people that are in the town that Ichabod interacts with, but the vast majority of them are sort of not super consequential to the story, right? And then what I was playing was
actually a really good example for this.
Yeah.
Because the main headless horseman guy is not,
Yes.
he's an intelligent creature, but his actions are totally directed by a secret villain.
Right. And that's what I was portraying was the secret villains, right? So in this case, there were 3 of them, and they were sort of moving in the shadows and doing things. And that's what I was portraying. So it wasn't that the NPCs, the other townsfolk are unimportant. It's just they aren't they're not movers and shakers for the plot unless the players wanted to find a way to draw them into that some way. It's just that the game is sort of structured in that this is a town of people who are going about their business, and there's this terrible beast, and then there's these 3 witches that are really the movers and shakers of trying to cause problems, right?
And I suppose this could work in any plot where you would have some sort of shadow organization as well. You could have somebody working as your shadow organization.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to mention, too, that at the beginning, you didn't really interact with the PCs either.
Right.
You had things that you could do in the background, just kind of telling me this is what I'm going to do, and then I would incorporate those things.
How about we talk about, because you're kind of going there already, specifically ways that we found or tools that we use to make this successful at our table in this case, right? So I think you touched on the first one there was initially just sitting there quietly, listening and sort of paying attention on my end of things as the game was playing out for ways, because there's this fine line between where I'm part of running the game in a way, so it's okay to use meta knowledge as long as it's not breaking the themes and the continuity of the game, right? So,
but not only is it okay, it's encouraged.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how you make this a useful role.
Correct. No, I agree. And I think it's important to actually explicitly say that, but to keep in mind that you have to keep that in check, because in the same way that a game master has complete reign of the world and can just crush any character, that's not the goal. The goal isn't necessarily, if you're running the antagonist, to win. You want to play for keeps, but at the same time, you need to think of it in the same way you would run antagonists if you were running the game. you're not trying to intentionally just crush the characters, right?
Right. Yeah. You're trying to tell an interesting story.
Right.
And so then you need to shift gears from I'm going to win and beat the other team to I'm going to create an interesting world for them to interact with.
Yes. So that's when my initial part of this, listening to them, how are they going to go about this? What plans are they going to set in motion? And keeping in mind that like the three witches that I have, they're watching everybody. So it's feasible that they would have some of this information already anyway, as there are new people coming to town and they're paying attention and they're watching. And what are they doing? How are they going about things, right? So with all of that and sort of having a light touch at the beginning, which I think is kind of critical because I feel like in a way, if you don't have that light touch in the beginning, it could set the players into a mindset that there's just no chance that they're going to be successful at this because now they're playing against two people instead of just interacting with the game master, right? Mm-hmm. So another thing that I think that made things more successful and much more interesting on my end of things was you gave me a stack of chips and said, these are things that you can do to spend them for actions, right? And once the chips run out, then you have raised enough suspicion to sort of reveal yourselves as the witches and the cause of, and somehow the cause of this problem, or that you are witches or whatever. So it kind of made it a game for me as well, in that I have a limited amount of things that I can do. Now, the game was going to go on for about 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, somewhere in that range. Mm-hmm. And I think I had 7 chips or whatever, fake chips or whatever to spend on significant actions. Now, it wasn't for every little thing I did, but it was like significant things that I did, right? And on my end of things, it made it much more fun for me because it was like, oh, I could do something here. Ooh, I don't know if that's really worth spending an entire action for, right? And like any resource, the beginning, you go through the first half pretty quickly, and then it's like, oh, do I really want to use this now? You know, how is this going to work? And so it made it, I would have enjoyed it regardless of how if I had those or not, but it added an interesting level to say, to set some limits on me, right? And to sort of, it also reinforced this thing to pace myself with the story so that I didn't burn through all that at once. And then it was like, okay, well, you know who I am. Come get me, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. I think something else that's important is in this game, and it would make sense too if you have a cast of NPCs, typically they're connected to the other NPCs in the world already, whereas your characters may or may not be. And having that network set up for you creates the opportunity for, because there's always going to be a natural suspicion among your players at the table. Right. And I mean, that's meta knowledge, but it's something you can't really get rid of. So if you're interacting with the GM on a different level than they are going to be suspicious of any direct interaction your character has with their characters at the table. So connecting you into the network of NPCs where you can barter favors with those people and have them interact in my voice with the other players rather than in yours is a good thing for kind of waylaying that suspicion a little bit.
Well, and then on in this specific case, and this is just something that I do generally speaking when I'm working in an adversarial role against people, information is key for anything, right? So there was, in this specific case, there was a young orphan boy that we took in named Oliver.
A double agent.
Yeah, who was a servant. So it was like, hey, my first thing I'm going to do is they're going to need someone with local knowledge, and he's an orphan boy, and he'll go work for him for, $2 or whatever that even means. I don't even know. And say, hey, I'll show you around. I know everybody in this town. I know where to get the best deals on whatever it was. And then it automatically wrote me into a source of information. Right. Mm-hmm. So I guess in terms of playing the antagonist, it's more about that subtlety. I feel like that's what the really fun, awesome part of this for me is that I can just focus on all the subtlety of manipulation and trickery and baiting people to do what I need and, bribery and all these kinds of fun things and not have to make any of the world move, right? Which is where I feel like connects directly to what you're talking about before, where when you're trying to portray a really full, robust world full of characters with some depth and NPCs and all this kind of stuff, it can be hard to you only have so much mental energy to spend on that stuff, right? So how are you able to actually really pay attention to some really truly conniving and devious things when you're trying to portray what all these other people are doing as well, right? Mm-hmm. And it's no matter how good of a storyteller you are, it's just not the same.
Well, and we all have our own voice.
Yes.
And I know I've said it before, like even on my most creative day, I'm only going to come up with the things that I would have come up with.
Right.
I'm not going to come up with the things that James would have come up with,
Well, and it's fun. It's like a collaborative thing too, back and forth. If I see as I sit there and listen to you running this game and what the players are doing, I have part of this is this experience of just us and knowing each other well and playing lots of games and knowing the themes that you like and your sort of creative sensibilities. I can have some kind of an idea of where you're going to push things as I watch a game unfold. And then I can take that into consideration and then blend that into my creative sense of what I want these people to do, right? But still knowing that it's your game and that I need to stay in line with the themes of the game and your creative sensibilities. I'm there to sort of like add detail and flourish to the game, not to set the color palette. Mm-hmm. Does it make? I think is that a good analogy or?
I wanted to mention we have kind of talked about it so far as an adversarial role, mm-hmm. but there's no reason that it couldn't be a cooperative role also. Sorry, gurgly. So in instances where maybe you have a player that's in or out. I mean, I know I've created games before where it's been an NPC that's helpful, and then you have to kind of like walk the line of being helpful with the NPC, but also
like
not
Gandalf?
doing everything. Less like a Gandalf and more like a Strider, right? Or a Gandalf is good too. Or if you were playing a Doctor Who game,
Well, I feel like Strider. No, I think Gandalf could work. But I think Strider's a better analogy in the first movie because in the second movie and third movie, he transitions into where he's actually part of the group, right? When they first encounter him, it's very clearly he's like above them, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and he's a ranger. Yeah. So I know for sure I've ran, adventure style games where people have had a guide or hired a guide, and then you get to this tricky point where like, how often am I just doing things for you with this NPC versus you guys solving your own challenges? And how do you walk that line? And how do you not make the NPC just this boring guy that, maybe flakes out at some point?
I think you can make it work. I just, in terms of being the person who would be doing it, I don't know that it would be as much fun to be on the player's side per se, as it would be to be working against them. Now, if you wanted some wicked double cross thing to happen, then I think it could be fun because you could just continually, in that sort of three-dimensional chess way, breadcrumb them along and help them where they need help, only to deliver
trap them in the gingerbread house and eat them.
Yeah, final monologue is you trap them in the gingerbread house and eat them. Gumdrops and all, the whole bit. So I don't know that we mentioned it explicitly, but we talked about those fate chips, right? And so I think there were a lot of things that went unsaid because playing in the game already, and then also our background with Mind's Eye Theater and LARP, right? But I think if you're going to do this and you don't have those experiences already, then you need to explicitly state some limits on how far you want them to go, right? In terms of how far they want to push things, or when do you like, oh no, I don't want the climax to happen yet, or something, whatever that is, right? There needs to be some direct communication specifically about tone and theme and how far you want to push things and what the game master thinks they want their climax to look like and what the conclusion of this session they want it to look like. Not not being on the rails, but like, I'm looking for some kind of a climax like this. I would like the game to finish on this kind of a note with this final battle with the Beast of Gévaudan or whatever, right? But I think that those things need to be said explicitly because, one, it sets the tone that if you haven't been in this kind of an assistant storyteller role, that you do need to acknowledge that this is not my game. This is your game, and I'm here to help build a more compelling story and portray some interesting characters. But at the end of the day, it's still your say and it's your game.
I agree with that entirely, but if you're going to do this, you also have to realize as a GM that you have to be willing to forfeit some control.
I agree. Yes, that's important to say as well.
And some people are not ready to make that step, which I totally understand. You're like, this is my baby. I don't want somebody to ruin it.
Well, and I think it's this sort of give and take that you have to learn to be able to do. And it is an interesting thing because I can remember in LARP where there were choices that were made by another storyteller or assistant storyteller or whatever the situation was, where it was like, ooh, I'm not sure that's a choice that I would have made. But realizing everyone is still having fun and this is still a solid game and I don't have to bat 1,000. And also, they may be setting something up that I don't necessarily know about or see coming because it's in line with their own creative sensibilities, right? So as long as it's not violating the tone and theme of the game, then I think you just sort of let it roll.
Well, and then absolutely under no circumstances should you go back and redo something you weren't happy with it.
And then it's also okay to say, hey, let's take a 5-minute break. Hey, where are you going with this? Like, what are you trying to think? Because sometimes you need to take those breaks and moments to be like, to sort of make sure that you're both pushing in the same direction, if that makes sense. Along with that, I think talking about theme and tone is critically important. And then understanding each other's creative sensibilities is a big thing as well. I don't think that this would work. Not that it couldn't, but chances are it wouldn't work as well if you're sitting down to do this as a one shot with a co-GM next to you that you don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Although I'd still be willing to try it.
Oh, it'd be interesting. Yeah, totally. Totally give it a shot and see what happens.
But it might be terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there any other, before we like sort of break down some other things, are there any other specific things you think should be conversations that should be had between the storyteller and assistant storyteller in these cases?
I don't necessarily think so.
I don't know that there are either. It's one of these things where it's
we didn't really mention it, but a lot of the conversation that happens between these two people is written communication or whispering. Yeah. It's not like said out loud, right. Hey, I want to do this thing to the players. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like that would be obvious, but maybe not.
Right. Well, and then I guess in those moments actually physically in the game, a lot of things that I had done, I had just written blurbs on paper. Now, they weren't seriously detailed, except for I think one note was detailed about a specific thing, but it was like larger actions of things that were going to take place. And also having to understand that whatever notes I'm passing you ideally shouldn't completely break the game. So we all know that there's these sort of ebb and flow of the game as you're running it, right? So then generally speaking, you did a pretty good job of you're running the game, you're doing the talking and sort of dictating things and saying what's happening. And then there's that part where the torch gets passed back to the players and maybe they're talking about amongst themselves about what they want to do. They're talking about what they want to do, but it's not like super detailed where you have to be like full on, like 100% invested. And you can read this, whatever it is, 15, 20 word note real quick and be like, oh, okay, that's what I need to incorporate.
And the actions of the assistant storyteller don't necessarily happen in real time like the player actions do. So you may give me something that you want to do, and I might wait a few minutes to wait to where in the story it makes sense for it to be happening.
Right.
Wherever it has the most dramatic effect is where I'm going to choose to drop your actions. Mm-hmm.
In the game that we're talking about, it was a classic LOTFP OSR style game, right? Mm-hmm. They were monster hunters coming to kill a monster, basically. Now, the adversaries that I was portraying didn't have any actual control over the werewolf. Right. So they were actually in just as much peril from the werewolf as the players were. Okay. So I think it's an important thing to note that when whatever kind of characters that you're going to be portraying, that they need to have weaknesses and flaws so that can be exploited by the players. But also it puts limits on what the assistant storyteller can be doing with them. Right. So they don't want to. You want to put yourself in a little bit of danger, but not a ton, right? And that's the other thing is...
There were lots of checks and balances in that game. So we talked about using actions and garnering suspicion. That wasn't necessarily suspicion from the players because they developed that on their own. That was suspicion from the overall townspeople in an era where being a witch is a very, very bad thing.
Yeah, it's going to get you set on fire. Right. I think on the assistant storyteller end of things, I think it's important to note that you don't want to play things so safe. Because you're not the characters. A lot of times the characters are playing things so safe. You want to, if you think about, Sleepy Hollow is a great example before, that the witch lady that was controlling the horsemen in that wasn't playing things so safe because it wouldn't be a great story then. It would just be Ichabod Crane came, did some investigation, got completely outwitted, and then died. And in which case... the players would have been playing the witch, and the assistant storyteller would have been playing Ichabod. And I think that's the important thing to always keep in mind is that whatever antagonist you're playing, you aren't the focus of the story. You are the foil, you are the pressure, you're the danger, but you're not the focus.
You're not the hero.
Yes, exactly. So in that specific game, it was sort of set up as a Monster Hunter game, right? So the adversaries that they were against, there was still a large danger in this quest thing, and then people that were working alongside that, kind of like in a what do you call it? Cross purposes, I guess you might say, right? Mm-hmm. But do you think this would work in a classic dungeon sense where you're going to run the game, right? And then we have a group of players playing wizard, thief, cleric, fighter, right? And I am playing or portraying the whatever it is, the kobold, shaman, and chieftain that are the lords of this dungeon. Do you think it works in that sense?
I think it could work if you gave the assistant storyteller role to the what I would call lieutenants of the dungeon. So you always have like your one main bad guy, but then you have so you got like your Sauron, right? But then below that you have like the weird chubby orc king, whatever his name was in the underground. Like he would be a cool assistant storyteller person. Right. Saruman would be a cool one. The leader of the Urukai, that could be the white orc. That could be, I mean, all of those are potential interesting roles that you could have someone bring a little bit more depth to, because that just makes them a better bad guy.
Well, and I think they're the bad guys that are directly connecting to the players.
Or what's his name at Helm's Deep? The advisor.
Oh, right,
the chief advisor guy. That's a good one.
Wormtongue.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that one actually is perfect because that's actually almost exactly in line with the setup we have initially, where there's someone working at cross purposes to things, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it makes a lot of sense in that analogy with using Lord of the Rings, where Sauron that's the game master, because that is the truly big bad.
He's the overarching eye in the sky.
Exactly. So I think that's a great analogy to what you're talking about. Or lieutenants in the dungeon, because then you could say, all right, you have 4 lieutenants in the dungeon or whatever it is, right? And so you can be calling for reinforcements and doing whatever and that kind of stuff.
And I think there's always, when it comes to classic dungeon crawl games, there's always some sort of GM angst that happens, right? If you just obliterate characters, then you're that TPK GM, you're the bad guy, the adversarial GM. But then sometimes you have the opposite problem where you're feeling like, I don't want them to feel like they're just being rolled. So then you're pulling punches, and then you're like the nice guy GM, and nobody really wants that either. Like, you want to feel like you earned the win when you're playing. And so this is kind of like a nice bridge. So if you made this sort of mid-level NPC that's supposed to be a force to be reckoned with, you can give them more personality and also have someone who's willing to play them to the full extent of their power and not feel guilty or...
No, I totally agree.
You know what I mean? Without that baggage.
There's this interesting moment sometimes when you're in the middle of a combat, and especially if you're playing something like 3rd edition or even 5th edition now, or LOTF PBX, and you're looking at the battle map if you've got it out, and it's like, what is the most effective way to use these minions, right? And because the players are all optimizing what they're doing because they've got one focus, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're running the game, you're trying to figure out what the characters are doing, what your monsters are going to do, and then also running the combat. Whereas if you do this, well, then it's like, I'm the lieutenants, so I give the commands, and then you're going to have the kobolds or whatever they are follow those commands to the best of their little cobalt brain abilities, and then sort of takes some of the weight of that off of you. So while the players are taking their actions, I can be strategizing about the monsters, and then you're just running the combat.
Oh, there's always something that gets missed too, right? Like, I've got 50 monsters I'm trying to keep track of, and oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that these goblins can't be flanked. I had no idea. Yeah. I completely forgot that, and we played the whole entire combat wrong, and you walked through them like mowing grass,
No, I agree. I think that could be a lot of fun, and the lieutenant way is kind of a cool way to do that. And then there's always the awesome, goofy moments that are going to happen because, well, if they're kobolds or goblins, well, they don't make the best decisions in the world anyway. What decisions do they make in the moment when you give orders? And then also, if you're the lieutenants, morale is something that doesn't get, I don't see get brought in a whole lot, right? But like if they fail their morale checks and they're starting to run away, well, then there's an incentive for the storyteller to be making those morale checks, and the players can be seeing them because then it's less adversarial with the GM and more adversarial with this assistant ST. I think that's something you touched on a minute ago.
Assistant storyteller playing like a goblin chieftain who just like beheads a goblin that's retreating, and then the goblins are like stuck in the field like, oh god, no. Both ways are bad.
Right.
What do I do?
You get a rifle, you get bullets, right? Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think in that sense it works. It could work for dungeon crawl stuff. So what about investigative stuff like Gumshoe? Do you think it works in a Trail of Cthulhu or Call of Cthulhu sense?
Okay, well, in any investigative game, you can always have a double agent. And I think you have to be a lot more sneakery about how you're communicating back and forth. Otherwise, people, like I said, are going to be naturally suspicious at the table.
Right.
But if you can manage to pull it off, that could definitely be really interesting. Now, the double agent scenario could definitely lead to a lot more upset, hard feelings at the end of the game.
I agree. I can see that.
But it could be really interesting for story purposes, for sure.
And I think it also, you can't do it every single time because it will wear out its welcome very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
But I think there's some interesting potential there. And we've done some stuff like that where everyone, or not everyone necessarily knows, but there's always some kind of either double agent or someone that has some, they've been, touched by the madness or whatever it is. So I think there's some interesting potential there, but I don't think it will work long term quite as well as some of the other ones will, if that makes sense.
Well, you can definitely use it in the same capacity as in the other things we've talked about too, for more interesting major characters along the investigative journey.
Right.
I just think the double agent thing is particularly interesting.
Right. So what about like high adventure stuff like Site 7C? I almost think this is the strongest place for it.
Okay. I mean, I feel like it could fit anywhere, but tell me where you see it in
so think about 7C for me, and just in general, really, really high adventure stuff, right? I immediately go to one of two things: Indiana Jones or Pirates of the Caribbean, right?
Pirates of the Caribbean has some really interesting neutral NPCs that I think would be cool for assistant storytellers. So like Calypso.
Right.
Would be an interesting role. So sort of one foot in both areas, but not really beholden. Yeah. It's not really adversarial. It's it's the neutral. What do they call it in Vampire? Independent. You're not beholden to Cam or Sabat.
I think there's some interesting stuff there. I agree with that. But I also think, what if you had someone actually playing Barbossa? Right. So like from the first movie where Barbossa is the bad guy. Right. And he is such a strong character and solid presence anytime he comes on the screen. And I think if you were to try and portray that, that takes a lot of effort to maintain that. Yeah. And I think that could be done that way.
I think I would add, as much as I said, having somebody communicating back and forth with the GM at the table makes players suspicious, they're also, well, from what I noticed, much less likely to just off the character if they're being played by someone else. Oh, yeah. So, just NPCs played by the GM are seen as a lot more disposable.
Yeah, expendable. We'll just get another one.
So maybe that would be a really good role for an assistant ST person, something that a character that you want to keep around. And kind of force your players to negotiate with in a different way.
Right. Well, and at the same time, if they actually, and I would suggest, whenever you do this, to make a full character for them, because it gives them a full complement of abilities and weaknesses and strengths. And so when you sit down with the character, which is the first thing that I did for much of the first part of the game, because while I was very familiar with my character, I wasn't familiar with Lee and Carrie's characters. So I went through and was very specifically looking, what spells do they have? What capabilities do they actually have? Because I had some kind of a knowledge, but wasn't really sure 100% whether they were hiding something from me or not. So I think in the same way that if you really have this full character in front of you, you can find ways to make your character survive stuff or play to your strengths in encounters to where it's going to be much more survivable for you than it would necessarily in the same way for a game master who is running the entire game and kind of knows, oh, they have these things that they can do, but I've got to manage everything else as well. Right.
Yeah. Things just fall through the cracks.
Right. So do you think it works in high adventure as well in that kind of a way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So what about, or what other, I don't want to say genres, but like types of game. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, it kind of does play into genre a little bit because a lot of the games that we play are very driven to work in a specific.
If you have the right crowd, it could be really fun for a romance sort of situation.
That could be fun. That could be true. Do you think this would work in a PBTA style game, or is that something that the MC should be solely focused on? Because just while you think about it, I feel like in classic apocalypse world or most of the Spirit of 77 games that we've played in, I feel like that should primarily be on the MC.
I'm glad you said that because I had actually thought at the beginning of the episode to mention it and had forgot about it between now and then. But we had talked about in the Night Witches game having Kurt play one of the inspector. I can't remember what you called him, but
commissars. Yeah,
commissars coming to the airbase to sort of investigate the shenanigans. Sort of like pull rank and pull things back in line. And then you had kind of had some qualms about how that would actually play out and work in play, and we ended up not doing that.
And that wasn't necessary. There's one part of it was scheduling, and then a second piece of it was timing of where the story was going. Because in that case, we actually record those. So it was like, well, these are long sessions that go on, and I don't want to have you come to the house to play if it isn't actually going to come up, that kind of stuff. So there were some logistical parts to that, and it just didn't come around. But I also think that specifically with PBTA stuff, it's so... I almost feel like the spirit of those games for the players, they're given much more creative license over the world. And in a way, if you're having a good time and leaning into it, you're sort of setting those things up and doing those things already. Right. So you all are playing your characters, but you also have one foot in the assistant storyteller role already because you're sort of leaning into things and then the way you build your histories with the other characters. And almost all of them have some kind of a way to, with different powers and moves, have negative effects on one another. So I think it's already built into it that you're already kind of doing that. Do you know what I'm saying? Now, I couldn't speak to every single PBTA game, but all of the ones that we play, I feel like it doesn't work.
Well, there's no real mechanical effect when you're being an assistant storyteller. So a lot of the other games we've talked about, you would make a character and have them kind of play that character for you.
Right.
So that's not to say that I don't think you would be able to find times in a Powered by the Apocalypse world game where it would be interesting to have another voice at the table to give life to a character. But mechanically, there would be no gameplay for the person within that role. I mean, I suppose you could have them make a character and then interact, but then how is that much different? It's just sort of like making a PC with different goals.
No, I agree. That's where I was kind of going to go, especially with regular Apocalypse World, right? One of the playbooks is the hard holder. So they're the one who's in charge of the overall hard hold, right? So that's sort of like how I see this sort of playing out. So maybe you have, let's say there's 4 players, right? And so one is the hard holder, and then the other 3 have their own playbooks and they're doing their own thing. And it's entirely possible that the hard holder is just trying to manage this gang of ruffians, which are your 3 characters. And in that way, I think you're just another player in that game. Maybe you don't have as much physical on-screen time. Doesn't mean you're not doing things in the background, but I don't think that you have as much direct spotlight time, if that makes sense. And I think in that sense, it fits in with that sort of everyone is already partial storyteller because of the way those games are played and the themes and the moves and the way it works. I just think it sort of the game functions a little bit differently.
Well, I think in straight up Apocalypse World, I don't see a lot of use for it, but I think it could be interesting in some of the more social-oriented Powered by the Apocalypse World games. So thinking about like Monster Hearts.
Right.
That could be interesting. Bedlam Hall, I think it could be really interesting if you were bringing in a character that was outside of the normal family, like a guest to the house. I think that could be an interesting role to have someone play. Like I did the Tesla game. It could be interesting to have someone play Tesla.
Right.
But again, you would have to know that person doesn't really have any mechanical effects. They just sort of speak things into existence.
Right. Well, I guess you could give them some custom moves and whatnot and make custom moves for them. So I think it could work in those senses, but I feel like those are more like guest star moments as opposed to assistant storyteller moments. Do you know what I'm saying? So like, hey, you're here for a game, and I've got this cool Tesla thing happening in this Bedlam Hall game. Why don't you play Tesla? Here's a couple custom moves for you, right? But I see that more as like a guest star or like a cameo.
So I guess then my question to you is, how is that different if you're helping to tell the story and advancing the plot? What makes that different?
I think specifically with PBTA stuff, I think it's that in like a BX game, like an OSR game, right? The characters don't have a lot of agency by the way the game is sort of like laid out and written, right? In the world to just sort of speak things into existence, right? Whereas in Powered by the Apocalypse, like Monster Hearts, like we talked about, or Bedlam Hall, when you make some of the moves and you ask those questions or answer some of those questions, it specifically gives you license to speak things into existence, right? And I feel like because of that, it changes the role of what the player is. They have more agency and more voice over what the world is. And that shared license to create the world, I think, changes things to where instead of having one head storyteller, an assistant, and a bunch of players who are interacting with this, now it's like we have an MC and a bunch of players / assistant storytellers, maybe to a less, like when you break that role down among 4 people, yes, it's a little bit less for all 4 people, but it's still all there. Do you know what I'm saying? Does it make sense?
Yeah, but let's say that the character that you're playing as an assistant storyteller is interacting with another player, and then a roll is made and it's, succeeding at a cost or failing at a cost. And then you, as the person being interacted with, are adjudicating the decision of that roll. So I don't know, to me, that feels very much like an assistant.
Well, but the same is true if we're playing Monster Hearts and I'm using a move against you and it says you gain a string on me and I have to do something you want, right? Like we're already doing that in a way. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but that's just in defining the connections with the strings. Like you're not doing that in...
No. So like in some of them
like
it says,
failing at a task.
Well, no, but like I think I don't know. I agree that it's kind of not clearly defined. Do you know what I'm saying? It may just be a style of play thing. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is that I think it just keeps coming back around to me that because of the way the moves are structured, that you're given more license to speak truth to the world and create the world as opposed to in like...
So just the degree of significance is not as different.
Yeah, because I think because of that, you could very easily just say, hey, you're going to make a character and we're intentionally going to set your character up as an adversary. Okay, fine. I think the rules within the game support that, because one thing that I like about PBTA stuff is that if you use a move against an actual player, it specifically says what it does. On a 10 plus, X happens. On a 7 to 9, choose one of these 3. On a 6 minus, they do this, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like in a way, because it's weird because you have more creativity, but there's actually very specific questions you answer. Do you know what I mean? So it's very specific, but you can answer this question any way you want. Do you know what I mean? Like, what does this failure look like to you? So it's very it's a very specific question, but it's very broad in what you can answer. And I think it sets you into a different mindset in that you're already sort of being a partial storyteller. Because one of the things that I have noticed with a lot of PBTA games is that if you are like have barely role played at all, PBTA it's easy to jump right into because it just says, how do I do this? Well, we're going to make these moves and then just roll and see what it says and answer those questions. Cool. That's easy for me to do. Right. Mm-hmm. Versus, or a person who's a more conventional role player, sometimes they have a hard time making that jump because you're not used to having that kind of license over the world. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps define this at all, but that's just sort of where my head is at with it, I guess.
Okay.
So I think specific to system, I think it's the only one that I would say that for, though. Stuff like Fate, I think it would work. Burning Wheel style, OSR, D&D. I think it could be a struggle with Gumshoe because of the way investigations are set up sometimes. But I agree that it could be fun to do a double agent thing, especially if you're playing like Night's Black Agents or some Dracula Dossier. There could be some really great moments of betrayal and being like, oh, the whole time, are you serious? Moments. But I think you have to use that sparingly. So do you think there's anything else to mention, or should we wrap this one up here?
I don't even know if I should give this any air. You were talking about the Gumshoe system, and then I was sort of thinking about Wraith, and I thought it would be really interesting if you had some like mental instability and lost time moments that were your actions were dictated by someone else.
So you had one person that played the shadows. Like that was just their job. Mm-hmm.
But like be in a Gumshoe world. So like, you're doing like your Hastur Yellow King mythos.
Right.
And
so
like
when you see the yellow sign and you have that blip of time lapse or whatever.
That you can't account for, like someone else who's not the GM has accounted for your actions and what they were.
That could be fun.
Has their own agenda.
That could be fun. I agree.
It's sort of awful, but...
No, I agree. It's one of those weird things that's kind of fun that way. And I don't know if this is worth mentioning in this, but if you have... I think it could work in a vampire social political style game, tabletop or LARP. But there was a game that I was running for Vampire, and we had a friend that moved away, and I had him make a elder vampire that was the adversary. So I played as the storyteller. I played the minions, and then the minions would report the session, what they knew about, to this other person, and then he would email me back and say, this is my plans, this is what I want to do and set in motion, and then I would take the actions of the minions. And it was interesting to see because everything was defined in terms of like what influence do you have and that kind of stuff. And part of the concession of the game was that my character this character was an elder, and he's never actually going to physically interact with anyone else because they're so far beneath him. That's what minions are for. So it worked in that kind of a way too. But it's
also a really cool way to incorporate people that can't make it to game or or living far away.
Yeah. And this was a thing where this wasn't online. It was like we had a physical. Everyone's around a physical table playing, and then I would report what happened and what the minions happened to them, to him, to Travis, and then he would email me back and say, hey, this is what's next, this is what I want to do, and then take things from there. So, and it was kind of an assistant storyteller role, I guess, because he was dictating what the adversary was doing, but more in a player style fashion. Do you know what I'm saying? If that makes sense. But that's sort of the way that vampire world is structured, because we approach that game the way we do it in LARP in a way. That's
those are like downtime actions, which you don't really see in like the regular tabletop world.
Right. But, So it was definitely a lot of fun doing. So I think there's a whole lot of potential here. It's just one of those things where you have to get used to sort of this give and take between the storyteller and assistant storyteller, and making sure you're both on the same level creatively and understanding your own sensibilities and theme and tone and stuff. But as long as you lay all that out at the beginning, I don't think that there's any reason why this wouldn't work for anyone, right?
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, lay it out at the beginning and be willing to release the reins a little bit.
That can be the biggest thing, is that you got to learn to sort of relax and let go a little bit. So I definitely understand. And it gets easier as time goes by as well. So yeah, this is definitely close to sort of what we had talked about with the 2 GMs, 1 game kind of thing happening that we had at HillCon a couple of years ago, but still drastically different in its own way. So I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of fun there. So if any of you out there have done something similar to this, or have thought about it, had success, had a great failure or whatever, let us know, because I would really be curious to see what game you tried it with and what the storyline was and how it worked and who played what, and just sort of how everything unfolded, because I think there's a lot of potential, but kind of strange because it's definitely against the grain of what we do in most tabletop games and the way they're structured. So I would really be curious to see how things went. So I think we'll wrap things up there. As you know, we are a member of the Gonna Geek Network, so you can head over to GonnaGeekNetwork.com and check all of the other geeky podcasts out there. And yeah, just check out some other awesome shows like Better Podcasting if you have your own podcast. They give great reviews of equipment and different technical advice over there, as well as several other geeky shows that involve all kinds of
all your favorite fandoms.
Yeah, all kinds of nerdery of different types, from console gaming to PC gaming to different TV shows and role-playing games and all kinds of stuff over there. So check them out at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. And the best way to support us is to let others that you know that don't listen to us, let them know about our awesome podcast and who we are. And if you like what we do here, you can go over to patreon.com/justonemorefix and support us over there and get access to all of our raw audio feeds and pre-shows, as well as our quarterly zine and print and PDF format, depending on what level you support us at. And you can join the awesome ranks of all of our Patreon supporters like Alistair H., Alan White, Hector Treelane, Simon McNair, Timothy Barra, Tiziano Furlano, and the OG Todd Olson. And I think that'll do it for us, and we will see you all next week. Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/justonemorefix or follow us on Twitter at Just One More Fix.